trajectories, there are key turning points or events that happen that change the trajectory in an important and life-changing way. Using the work of Glenn Elder, he says that there's 5 important aspects of the life course perspective, which are timing, linked lives, the individual's bounded agency within what they can do, historical time, or another way of saying a period effect, and finally, as well, geographic place. Within fertility studies, this has been widely used, this perspective, although actually geographic place is probably the one that has gotten the least amount of attention. This is all to say that people exist in a social space. The people around them and the place around them affect their ability to make decisions, they affect their life course trajectories, and what events are going to occur. And even though there is, of course, rhetoric around this idea of being a global citizen, everyone exists within their own physical surroundings. This is important to say that our lives are not only affected by the physical surroundings around us, but the people around us. And we are not absent from the people around us. Of course, there's different types of people. Family is the most studied aspect, and family is probably the most important link within our lives. However, other individuals like friends, neighbors, religious and ethnic communities also play an important role. So this is all to say, how do we capture geographical embeddedness when thinking about the transition to parenthood? One option is to think about our belonging or our sense of connection to the neighborhood or to the local area around us. Using the work of Anton Seek, he talks about the concept of belonging, which is actually a slippery and tricky concept. In fact, it's very difficult to translate to other languages. But he breaks down this idea of belonging into 2 key aspects. The first one is place belongingness, or this idea of feeling at home in a physical location. And this is particularly tied to the ontological comfort and security that you feel from being at home in an area. But there's also the politics of belonging, which have to do with the other people within your area and who are part of the ability to access resource and either include or exclude your ability to function within that physical area. When thinking about how to connect this idea of belonging and parenthood, there's multiple aspects in which belonging could influence parenthood. That's through emotional well-being, which we've seen studies that people who have a higher subjective sense of well-being have a higher likelihood of becoming parents. This is through aspects like local social capital, whether it's information sharing or resource sharing or access to jobs. And we've seen, particularly from Eastern Europe in the 2000s, several studies show that there's some association between social capital and the transition to parenthood. And the third one could be the place stability, or this idea of being able to have somewhere to settle down and make a very life-changing transition. While this was theorized by Estoni et al. In 1999, there's very little empirical work on this subject. Of course, the elephant in the room with all of this is that people don't stay in one place in their life. They move around quite often, and particularly a lot of residential mobility happens in that period between the end of secondary school and the birth of the first child. So when thinking about residential mobility, we know from different causal models that soon-to-be parents make residential moves in anticipation of parenthood. Furthermore, the mean residential move within the United Kingdom is actually only 5 kilometers, suggesting that people want to change dwelling in order to have the space or the amenities that they need without losing this social network that they've built up around them. And other more long-distance moves are oftentimes tied to educational and employment opportunities. Furthermore, we know that the length of time in current residence is the single biggest predictor of someone's sense of belonging in the neighborhood, which makes sense. As someone lives longer in their place, they become more tied emotionally to where they're at. And finally, of course, there are people, we can capture people who move, but not everyone who wants to move will move. So you looking at the desire to move, we see that those who desire to move have a lower sense of belonging, while those who desire to stay have a higher sense of belonging. All of this put together, I have come up with several research questions. I know, it's a lot, but I'd love feedback about the actual direction. So my research question is, how does a stronger sense of belonging associate with the transition to parenthood? And this is the main question here. And I hypothesize that it should be a stronger sense of belonging is positively associated with a first child. However, dealing with all of these aspects of residential mobility, there's several aspects in which we need to consider how does residential mobility play into this. And the second research question is, how does living closer or further away from family change this association? And I hypothesize that belonging mitigates or moderates some of this negative sense of living further away from family, when also factoring in that people move for parenthood reasons. And it's what role does belonging play for recent movers in particular? And I hypothesize with hypothesis 3 that a higher sense of belonging signifies an emotional investment in the neighborhood. And for recent movers, it increases the association between belonging and parenthood. As well, higher belonging narrows the gap in association for those who move short or long distances. Furthermore, with the preference to move, because we want to see who would like to move but doesn't, I hypothesize that though belonging helps overcome some of the negative aspects of those who would like to move but are not capable in the transition to parenthood. And finally, of course, fertility decisions are made not only by the individual but at the couple level. So I ask, how does a partner sense of belonging interact with the sense of belonging of the other individual? And I hypothesize that a partner's high sense of belonging should reduce the negative association. And because, of course, women have much more significant consequences of transitioning to parenthood, I would think that a woman's sense of belonging will have a larger effect than the man's sense of belonging. That was a really dense slide, I'm aware. But to summarize it, I think that basically, within these measures of parents' distance or time in current residence or the distance of the move or the preference to move, we see that these should have an association with the transition to parenthood, and that belonging to the neighborhood, the subjective sense of where you belong in the neighborhood, has a moderating effect on these measures.
So you're taking into account the neighborhood when the first child is already born? Or the child is already born?
I don't understand. Can you ask again?
You are taking into consideration the neighborhood where the couple will become parents.
It's their sense of belonging in that neighborhood. Yes. In order to test this, I use the Understanding Society data, which asks, which asks questions about the sense of belonging in waves 1, 3, 6, and 9. I select only partnered individuals because we know there's a lot of aspects around residential mobility with at least one person needing to move in with the other person, if not both of them moving, when on the start of cohabitation. I select only individuals of fertility ages 18 to 45. And for our couple analysis, I select only different sex couples simply because there was only 2 first birth events for same-sex couples. The individual sample is just slightly under 17,000 with slightly under 1,500 first birth events. When I look at only recent movers, which are people who moved within the previous 4 years, I have slightly under 4,000 observations and 545 first birth events. And the couple sample gets basically cut in half because we're pairing the couples together, although the proxy interview didn't ask the sense of belonging. So if the couple is through, or the partner is through a proxy interview, I don't have their sense of belonging. So it's slightly under half, and 678 first birth events. My explanatory variable is part of the Neighborhood Cohesion Index, and it simply asks the statement, I feel like I belong to this neighborhood. in which people answer on a Likert scale of 1 to 5, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. When I look at the composition of this measure, we see that for the most part, most people, 54.7% of the observation, either report strongly agreeing or agreeing with the statement, while only 11.4% strongly disagree or disagree with the statement. This is a positively skewed distribution, but it becomes more left, or a negatively skewed distribution, but it becomes more left skewed for those who are recent movers, those who report preferring to move, those who are in private or social rent, for younger individuals, and those who report a lower subjective well-being. To analyze this, I use multi-level logit regression with random effects at the individual and the household level. The dependent variable is a live birth, first birth when in the discrete period following the interview. So that's in that intro interview period, with the explanatory variable being what I showed previously, used on a discrete scale. The model specifications for the research questions include looking at the parent's location, whether the parents live within 30 minutes or not. I look at recent movers, those who moved only within the previous 4 years, and how far they moved, under or over 5 kilometers. I look at well as those who report a preference to move, either preference to stay or preference to move. And then I look at couples together. And I control for various socio-demographic characteristics, and I use cross-sectional weights. The first step was to look if there's any relationship between belonging at all and my other model specifications. And while there is empirical work on the other aspects, such as the preference to move, I couldn't find any empirical work looking at the parent's distance and the sense of belonging to move. And for the parent's distance, we see that within my analytical sample, even split are between 42% of those who have parents who are living under 30 minutes away and those who have parents living over 30 minutes away, while about 16% are either deceased or they didn't report their parents' distance. And we see that there is a correlation from the chi-squared residuals between those who have parents living close and those who report a higher sense of belonging to the neighborhood, or the opposite direction for those who have parents living further away. When looking at the results of the multi-level model, we see first off that there is a relationship that when, and this is in odds ratios, when parents live further away, there's a lower association with the transition to parenthood. When we add in a sense of belonging to the neighborhood, we see that there is a positive association between belonging to the neighborhood and the transition to parenthood, and that the household and individual effects explain about 13% of this variation. When we interact the parents' distance and the belonging to neighborhood, we see that we lose some of our statistical significance, but we still remain with a slightly positive relationship between belonging to the neighborhood and a negative relationship between the parents' distance. This effect is slightly stronger, however, though, for those who moved within the previous 4 years, with a fairly strong positive relationship between a sense of belonging and those who have recently relocated. To examine the interaction effects a little bit closer, I plot the predicted probabilities of the interaction effects. And we see from a scale of strongly disagree to strongly agree, 1 to 5, that for those who, we see that those who live close to their parents have a stronger predicted probability across the entire scale of transitioning to parenthood than those that live further away. However, as people have a stronger sense of belonging, it appears that the gap between the two starts to narrow, And the sense of belonging in some ways narrows the gap between these two factors. Looking closer at this same analysis, but stratifying the sample between recent movers and those who are more long-time residents, what we see immediately is that the predicted probabilities of recent movers is much larger than those of long-term residents. This mirrors previous analysis, which shows that like recent moving is associated with the transition to parenthood. However, what's really interesting here is that we see that those who are living further from their parents and those that are living closer don't have a strong convergence between the blue and the orange line here for recent movers. However, belonging itself increases the likelihood of the transition to parenthood. While for long distance individuals, we do not see this large increase in the sense of belonging, although we do see some convergence between those who live closer and further from their parents. When looking at the distance moved, because some distance moves might be quite short, we see again, as predicted, that those who moved in shorter distances have a higher predicted probability of transitioning to parenthood than those that moved over 5 kilometers. However, as we increase the sense of belonging, as the sense of belonging to the neighborhood increases, sorry about that, we see that this actually converges and that the sense of belonging seems to moderate the effect of the actual distance moved. Again, this is not just at recent movers, but back at the entire sample, looking at those who report a preference to move. Again, we see that those who say no, that they do not want to move, have a higher predicted probability of transitioning to parenthood. However, again, belonging seems to moderate this effect. And for those who prefer to move, but have a high sense of belonging, they actually have a higher predicted probability of reporting or of transitioning to parenthood. Okay, the final aspect was to look at the couples. And the first aspect was to see if there is any correlation between the men's and the women's sense of belonging. And using the chi-square residuals on the diagonal line in blue in the middle, we see that men and women within the couple have a highly correlated sense of belonging within the couple. And when I plot the odds ratios of the model here, using both the discrete women's and discrete men's sense of belonging within the partnership, we see that they have very similar odds ratios between the men and the women in orange at the top. And then I see, even when I interact it with the distance to the parents, in this case, I only use the mother's distance because of complications with having so many aspects of also including fathers in it. We don't see any significant changes in the actual reported odds ratios. Also, very interestingly, I thought there might be some relationship between whose mother lives closer, but comparative to where they both live close to their mother, it doesn't seem to have a big difference if it's his mother or her mother, but there is a statistically significant difference between if they both live far away from their mothers. Just plotting this here, we see that, of course, I'm just going to skip this for now. That's too much. Okay, anyways, so to conclude, a stronger sense of belonging to the neighborhood is associated with the transition to parenthood. It appears that belonging to the neighborhood moderates the relationship between the parent's location, the residential mobility, the moving distance, the preference to move, and this relationship with the entry to parenthood. Our results suggest that not only do the objective measures of residential location matter in the transition to parenthood, but also the subjective sense of belonging. This is to say, oh, Ingrid. Feeling at home and having a local sense of connection, the two aspects of belonging, are an important and overlooked aspect of the transition to parenthood. We find that partners having a higher sense of belonging can slightly moderate the negative sense. I'm sorry, that was what the slide updated. We don't find any particularly strong gendered aspects, and it appears that within couples, that the sense of belonging is very similar. There is, of course, limitations to this study. First off, I used parents' location because my original idea was to try to see if people are living in their hometown, but A, defining hometown turns out to be a very theoretically difficult thing to do, and B, I don't actually have these variables. So we use parents' location as a proxy, but parents might also move. Unfortunately, I just don't know where the people actually grew up, and I don't have any information where non-parental relatives are living. I also wanted to look at friendship, but if you look at the number of reported friends in Understanding Society, there's a really bad clustering where people report 5, 10, 15, 20 friends like this. So we didn't use this measure. I also wanted to see if I could look at some of the aspects I directly hypothesized, which is the mechanisms for why belonging would increase, but they are either directly correlated with belonging or they just don't exist in the data set. And finally, of course, I'm looking at first birth and residential transition, the two aspects most commonly associated with survey attrition, which makes this study, of course, biased, and I can only look in my only analytical sample, but there will be some attrition due to those two factors. Oh, well, forget that slide. And then I have a next step. I want to continue looking at the couple model because I only was looking as covariates within the model, but it's not a true dyadic model. I recently got aspect to the lower super output area data to connect. So I might be able to look at some of the neighborhood characteristics. And I want to continue because what I didn't cover here is that there's a aspect between when people move in life, which is that people tend to leave their parental home. This is a typical trajectory, not the trajectory of everyone, of course, but there's some groups of people that tend to go from their parental home to eventually cohabitation, while other higher educated and some ethnic groups tend to do this other traditional transition, which is to moving out of the parental home to attend higher education, and then oftentimes moving to urban centers before moving into cohabitation, so that there is a strong link between belonging and certain residential trajectories, and within the UK, certain ethnic and class groups. Thank you very much, everyone, and I look forward to your questions.